Watani Stiner was once one of the most wanted men in America, accused of the shooting deaths of two Black Panther leaders on the campus of UCLA. Watani Stiner said he was innocent of the crimes he was accused of, but the courts disagreed, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But while for most people that would have been the end to their story, for Watani Stiner, it was just the beginning. Larry Watani Stiner was born on January 30th, 1948, in Houston, Texas. He was born during a time when southern states had laws that enforced racial segregation, and his first few years of life were spent going to segregated playgrounds and movie theaters, even beaches. So to get away from the legalized racial discrimination of Texas, Watani's mother moved the family to Southern California when he was 7 years old. They moved into the housing projects located in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. Watts didn't have the laws that enforced segregation like Texas did, but there was still extreme racism in Los Angeles that included police brutality. This type of racism caused anger in communities like Watts, and in 1965, when Watani was 17 years old, that anger exploded. The Watts Rebellion, brought on by the mistreatment of LA police officers, it lasted 6 days and resulted in widespread rioting, looting, and community devastation. 4 months before the Watts riots, Watani Stiner had graduated from high school, gotten a good job, got married, and he and his wife were expecting their first child. Life for Watani was good. But after the Watts riots, something inside him changed. Fighting for injustice felt right, and Watani was done with just accepting racism. He became motivated by words like those of Malcolm X, who taught to demand freedom and justice by any means necessary. One night in 1966, Watani came across a group of young Black men and women speaking in a language that he'd never heard before. The group invited Watani to join them and explained that they were speaking Swahili, the native language of East Africa. He then learned that many from the group were part of an organization called US, founded by Ron Karenga in 1965. US was a cultural nationalist organization that came from the idea of us versus them. US's goal was Black self-determination, and they believed that Black people should reject views and values of the oppressors. Watani shared these beliefs and joined the US organization. He changed his name from his birth name Larry to the African name Watani, and he became dedicated to a revolutionary change. Watani's brother also became a member of US. Another group fighting for change was the widely recognized Black Panther Party. Although very different groups, the US organization and the Black Panthers did agree on one thing: that society as a whole was racist and radical change was needed. But the US organization defined that change as the need to focus on promoting traditional African culture, whereas the Black Panthers argued that Black people in America had already established a culture and didn't need to embrace African traditions. But while the Black Panthers and the US organization were busy debating, the United States government was putting together a plan to take both groups down. The plan was called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. The government's COINTEL program, which was ran by the FBI, was designed to disrupt, discredit, and destroy all potential Black leadership in the country. To do this, the FBI sent letters with death threats to leaders from each group, but made the letters appear to be sent from the other group, so that each would believe that the other group was threatening them. And this plan worked. It created so much tension and hostility between us and the Black Panthers that neither group trusted the other. In the fall of 1969, Watani was attending courses at UCLA. Other US members and Black Panthers were also attending school there. Members from both groups were part of the UCLA Campus Black Student Union, which meant, even though there was tension because of the forged FBI letters, both the groups still had to work together on certain issues regarding Black students. One of these issues was the appointing of a new director for the Afro-American Studies Center. But the US organization and the Black Panthers disagreed on who that new director should be. So on January 17, 1969, members from both groups gathered in UCLA's Campbell Hall to have a meeting to discuss the matter. But just as the meeting was ending, there was a deadly shootout that left 2 Black Panther leaders dead.
At approximately 2:45 p.m. this afternoon, 2 men were murdered at the UCLA campus. Their names are John Huggins, 23 years old, and Al Prentice Carter, 26 years old. They were attending a meeting at the campus where the Black students were discussing the qualifications for the director of the Afro-American Studies Center.
The next day, the Los Angeles Police Department put out an all-points bulletin for the arrests of Watani Stiner and his brother, George Ali Stiner. 3 days after that, Watani turned himself in and was arrested for the murder of John Huggins and Bunchy Carter. But police knew at the time of Watani's arrest that he wasn't the actual shooter. Witnesses had already identified 21-year-old Claude Herbert as the man behind the trigger. But because Watani and Claude Herbert were both members of the US organization, and because Watani was there with Claude Herbert at the time of the shooting, Watani was booked for conspiracy to commit murder. But from day one of his arrest, Watani maintained his innocence, telling his attorney there was never a conspiracy to kill John Huggins or Bunchy Carter. Watani called the shooting a spontaneous event provoked by an argument. Watani stated that just as the meeting on the UCLA campus was ending, a heated argument broke out between an US member and a female member of the Black Panthers. This argument escalated into a fight between both groups that resulted in shots being fired from both sides. Watani was hit in the shoulder. John Huggins and Bunchy Carter both hit in the chest. But during Watani's trial, the district attorney for the prosecution and the Black Panther Party told a different version of what happened that day. They stated that US member Claude Herbert arrived at the UCLA meeting with a plan to kill John Huggins and Bunchy Carter, and that Watani Stiner and his brother were in on the plan. Watani's defense argued back that there was no evidence to prove such a conspiracy, but a judge disagreed. Watani Stiner and his brother were convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and sentenced to 7 years to life in prison. Watani was 21 years old. Claude Herbert, the man who shot and killed John Huggins and Bunchy Carter, immediately went on the run after the shooting. He escaped out of the country and was never caught. 5 years into Watani's life sentence at California's San Quentin prison, he started to believe his life was in real danger. His outspokenness and political views had made him a target, and he got a tip that prison guards might be setting him up to be killed. So a sympathetic Black prison guard and a vocational counselor agreed to help Watani and his brother escape. In the middle of the night, on March 30th, 1974, Watani and his brother rolled up their pillows and blankets and stuffed them under their bed sheets to make it look like they were sleeping. They made their way through a back door to the outside of the prison, ran 50 yards across the grass, and climbed over an 8-foot-high cement wall to a waiting car. Behind, they left a note for their parents that read, "Dear Moms and Pops, "Sorry we had to do it like this, but circumstances demanded it." Watani and his brother disguised themselves as traveling preachers and made their way out of the country to South America, where other black prisoners were also living in exile. Here, Watani stayed for 20 years. He got remarried and had children. But living in South America was not easy, and at times it was dangerous. Watani became concerned for the safety of his wife and children. So in 1994, he walked into the U.S. Embassy and negotiated his surrender, on the terms that the U.S. government would grant his family entry to the United States. Watani's brother stayed in South America. Many connected to the case, including Watani, assumed that because he had served 5 years before his escape and had turned himself back in, that he would only do a few more years of his 7 years to life sentence. But what they hadn't realized was that after Watani escaped to South America, the government labeled him a domestic terrorist and international fugitive. So after his return, he was sent back to San Quentin for another 21 years. On January 11, 2015, Watani Stiner was released from prison after serving a total of 26 years. Since being released from prison, Watani's been featured in many articles and interviews. And although he maintains he's innocent of what sent him to prison all those years ago, he does express sadness for what happened that day at UCLA in 1969 and for the lives that were lost. Today, Watani continues his work towards social justice, using stories and history from his generation to give strength to the next generation.